president of Kappa Delta Pi, and I'm from Mu Sigma chapter at Manhattan College in New York. There are handouts that give you an overview biography of our new laureates. As you know, the laureate chapter was started in 1924. John Dewey was the first nominee and the first inductee into that chapter. We've had many distinguished educators throughout the years, over 250. Eleanor Roosevelt, Albert Einstein, Margaret Mead, George Washington Carver, to name just a few of those. And during this convocation, we're adding 5 additional distinguished laureates to that group. Today, our speakers, in the order that they're going to occur, are Dr. Joel Westheimer, Dr. Stephen Ball, Dr. David Gillborn, and Dr. Jacqueline Jordan Irvine. Dr. Ball is a Distinguished Service Professor of Sociology of Education at the Institute of Education, University College London, and most recently Karl Mannheim Professor of Sociology in Education. Dr. Gillborn is Professor of Critical Race Studies and Director of the Center for Research in Race and Education at the University of Birmingham in the United Kingdom. Dr. Jacqueline Jordan Irvine is Charles Howard Candler Professor Emeritus at Emory University, and also held positions as visiting professor at the University of Maryland, College Park, and visiting scholar at Howard University. Dr. Irvine's specialization is in multicultural education and urban teacher preparation, particularly in the education of African Americans. And finally, Dr. Joel Westheimer is University Research Chair in Democracy and Education at the University of Ottawa, and education columnist for CBC Radio's Ottawa Morning and Ontario Today shows. All of our speakers have many books, hundreds of articles, and probably thousands of speaking engagements. We're very excited to welcome our new laureates into our midst. And now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Joel Westheimer.
Thanks so much for coming this morning. I was talking to my son, Ben, and I told him, he asked me where I was going, to Orlando, Florida. He said, "Isn't that where Disney World is?" I said, "Yes, but we'll go another time." Anyway, he said, "Well, what are you doing there?" I said, I'm going to this Kappa Delta Pi conference, and it's a place where people who are teachers and people who are becoming teachers can come together, and it's a teacher conference in some ways." And he said, "Well, what's a teacher conference?" And I said, "Well, teachers can come together and talk to each other and learn from each other and learn from others and people studying education." And I could tell, I was going on, but I could tell he had stopped on something that he was fixating on. And I said, "What is it?" And he looked at me and he said, "Teachers talk to each other?" And because, right, and you realize, you get inside the mind of a kid, right? This is what happens from a kid's perspective. The teacher says goodbye at the end of the school day, the kids start going out the door, the teacher's there, he's waving, and then the last kid leaves the room and the teacher's like this. And then the next day, the first kid comes in, and the teacher says, "Hey, how you doing?" Because teachers don't have lives outside of school, right? I taught in the New York City public schools, the Upper West Side of Manhattan, but it was a magnet school, drew kids from all over. But some of the kids were from that neighborhood, and they would see me in the supermarket, and they'd say things like, "Mr. Westheimer, you buy tomatoes?" And I'd say, "Yes, teachers buy tomatoes too," right? Because there's a life for teachers outside of school as well as inside of school. And since John Dewey has already been invoked once in this session, and it was also his birthday just a few days ago, 156th anniversary of his birthday, I think. Let me start by linking John Dewey to democratic education, which is what we're all here to talk about. Because Dewey, in many ways, big and small, was the father of a progressive education that oriented teaching and learning, or that sought to orient teaching and learning around ideas of democratic thinking. But I worry, and I thought about it when I was invited to do this panel, that today democratic teaching and learning, we throw that word around, democracy in education, democratic education, as if everyone agrees about what that means, as if it means one thing. But of course it means a zillion things, right? And when I talk to my university students, I always ask them for their definitions of democratic thinking, democratic teaching and learning, and there are many. I mean, in this very room, we probably all have different ideas. Let me just give you an example of maybe 2 or 3. For some people, democratic education means teaching about democracy, right? How I was about to say Parliament because I'm coming from Canada, I just did a talk there, but how the Congress works, how bills become a law. You remember those schoolhouse grammar rock band things? Yeah. Learning about how government works, right? About democracy. For other people, teaching democratic education is more about teaching democratically, right? Allowing the kids to help set the vision of the curriculum and allowing them into co-facilitating the education that they're getting. For other people, teaching democratic education is teaching for democracy, right? It's doing things in the classroom that help kids be better democratic citizens, right? Function in the democratic society. And to make things more confusing, of course, as much as professors like all of us love to put things in little boxes, of course no one fits neatly in those boxes, and in fact some people put forward the idea of teaching democratically, organizing the classroom democratically, as a way to teach for democracy. They say you can't teach swimming by reading about swimming, you have to swim. So you can't teach democracy by reading about democracy, you have to practice democracy. As we all know, very often that sort of falls and becomes, is reduced to deciding like the napkin colors for the prom or other meaningless democratic engagement, but sometimes it really is about running the whole school. So I'm only talking for a few minutes here, and we'll have more time in discussion, but I'll tell you just at the outset, there's tons to talk about all 3 of those, and there are many more, but I'm just gonna zero in on that last one, okay? Teaching for a democratic society, teaching for democracy. And the way I'd like to do that is I'd love to do a quick thought experiment with you, okay? If you can imagine for a second that the person behind you puts a blindfold around your eyes, and you are suddenly whisked out of this room right here and whisked into outer space, and the earth is spinning below you, and you're no longer in Orlando, you're no longer in Florida, you're up there, and then suddenly you're plopped back down somewhere on the planet Earth in a classroom. Okay? And the blindfold's taken off, and since it's a thought experiment, let's pretend that you can't tell where you are by the language that people are speaking, or by the dress that they're wearing, or food, or any other cultural cues, okay? But you're in a classroom, and you sit, and you spend an hour or so, and you observe whatever lesson is going on in that classroom. Or maybe you see 2 or 3 lessons. So here's my question. Would you be able to tell whether you had landed in a classroom in a democratic country, the US, Canada, France, wherever else, or in a totalitarian dictatorship? And it sounds like a facetious question, because many of us would like to say, well, of course, I mean, that schooling in a democratic society is nothing like schooling in a totalitarian society, right? In a totalitarian society, you don't want citizens who are engaged and who question things. You want people to follow the rules and go by one official story handed down by the leader of North Korea or China or Iran, right? Whatever it is, whether it's a religious theocracy or a military dictatorship, there's one official story. But I didn't mean the question facetiously, because when you think about it, a lesson in fractions, in science, even in certain aspects of history, in the life cycle of a glowworm, all of those are going to be very similar, right, in schools in North Korea as they are going to be in classrooms here. So for me, it raises this fundamental question that I don't think we think about that often, which is, should there be any differences in schools in classrooms in democratic societies than those in totalitarian dictatorships? And I would like to say that the answer is yes, because while in many societies around the world, let's not pretend they're completely and utterly and totally different from us, right? All societies, let's just take character education as an example. How many of you have character education in your school? You know if you have character education programs in your school because there's posters around the school that say, like, Monday is honesty, Tuesday is integrity, Wednesday you don't have to be honest anymore because that was Monday, right? Things like that, right? It's these pillars, right, of good character. And, they're nice pillars. I mean, we all want to be around honest and ethical and people who have integrity and who don't litter or who show up to work on time or who dress nicely. These are the kind of people we want to live next door to. But so do the leaders of every totalitarian dictatorship in the world. There's not a country on the planet that doesn't want its citizens to pay taxes, to show up to work, to help an old person across the street, not to do drugs, not to litter, to help clean up a park, right? There's no country that doesn't want its citizens to do that. So what's different about a democratic society, and what responsibilities do schools have in a democratic society to teach something different? So I would like to suggest that the main central principle of a democratic education is teaching kids a couple of different things, but the most important one is to ask questions. To what is, as a buzzword, called critical thinking. I don't like to use that term for a number of reasons. First of all, there's a saying among teachers, people say, everyone likes to teach critical thinking, but no one wants a classroom full of critical thinkers. Which is true. Like, you don't want, Mr. Westheimer, how do we know the Doorman Invasion was in 1066? Because it says so in the textbook. Just like, you don't want them asking questions about everything, right? But you want them asking questions about a lot of things. And asking questions is fundamental to a kind of thinking that is consistent with democratic society. Because questioning and dissent is the engine of progress for a democracy, right? Without it, you don't have democracy. You don't have movement. You stay the same. We would still have slavery. Women wouldn't be able to vote, right? And so on and so on. So what are our schools doing to teach those kinds of habits of mind and those kinds of thinking? Now, I was engaged in research for many years about programs that aim to teach democratic citizenship. So I'm not even talking about, there's a whole different talk here about the fact that schools are so myopically focused right now on standardized testing and accountability in only math and literacy that other subject areas are just pushed off the table altogether. And I'll say one more thing about that before my time is up. But even within those schools that are teaching or claiming to be teaching democratic citizenship, there's some odd stuff going on. Joe Kahn and I from Mills College in Oakland, California, did more than 10 years of research on schools that aim to teach democratic citizenship, and we found that there were these kinds of three different visions of what it meant to be a good citizen embodied in those schools. The first was the personally responsible citizen. And those were people like the character education program that I just told you about. They want kids to be honest, to show up to work, to stand in line, to listen to the teacher, not to talk back, things like that. They have personal responsibility and good things too, not just only those, but also being a nice person, helping out and so forth. A second kind of vision of good citizenship was the participatory citizen, we called that. And that was where these programs explicitly wanted kids to get involved. Getting involved is a key phrase, right? They want kids to know about how government and community organizations work and pitch in, help out. Service learning is a big, big umbrella for participatory citizenship. And then there were some programs that had a slightly different vision of a good citizen, because those programs are the ones that I'm talking about. They ask kids to ask tough questions about the root causes of problems in our society. Right? So, one of the ways I think about it is that if the participatory citizens are organizing a food drive, right, because they're getting involved, so they're organizing a food drive, what are the personally responsible citizens doing? They're donating a can of food because they're nice people, right? So they're bringing in a can of food. The social justice-oriented citizens are perhaps doing those things too, but they're also asking, how come in one of the richest countries in the world, there are people who are hungry? Right? How can that be? Like one program in the social justice-oriented camp told this story. I love this parable. And this is what I write about in my new book, What Kind of Citizen? Educating Our Children for the Common Good. And my publisher always loves me to say that I'm going to do a book signing, so I have to say that later today. But what this guy from this program said this. He tells this story. He says there are these people down by the river, this village, and they're all down by the river, they're washing clothes. And suddenly, one of them looks up and sees this basket floating down the river with a baby in it. It's a little biblical. And so he goes, oh my God, there's a baby floating down the river. So they run into the river, they grab the baby, they dry the baby off, they feed the baby, someone takes it home, changes its diaper, houses it, and they find the next day the village is down by the river and they're doing their laundry again, and 2 babies are floating down the river. And you know where this is going, right? Then 3, then 4, then 5, and soon the whole village is occupied in getting these babies out of the water. And someone from the village says, hey, why don't we look upstream and find out where these babies are coming from? And everyone says, no, we have no time, just grab a baby, grab a baby. And what's the lesson of this, right? The lesson is that we all have a human, a moral imperative to help those in need in front of us. Of course, direct service is very important. We need to help a hungry child, right? But if we don't look what's causing all those hungry children, we're idiots, right? Because they're going to keep coming down the river. And so you need both. Okay? Programs that we've seen in schools, and there are not enough of them, again and again, that teach a democratic form of thinking. Okay, it goes back to the Thomas Jefferson quote. If the people, I'm going to paraphrase it terribly, but I'm not Thomas Jefferson. If a citizenry is not well educated enough to govern their own affairs, then the solution is not to take that power of governance away from them, but to educate them. And that's what we're talking about here. So the question I'd like to leave you with is, what should schools do to convey and to nurture that kind of thinking? Democratic thinking in the sense of being able to ask questions, to analyze social policy, and to come to conclusions or to deal with multiple perspectives and come to one's own conclusion through your own sense of independent thought. Now, these are not things to take easy to take up pedagogically. Oh, we have problems of, is it indoctrination, or are we conveying one side of the school? I mean, all forms of education are indoctrination, but these are, I'm not flip about those challenges. These are pedagogical problems, right? But let's first get our goals straight. The purpose of an education in a democratic society needs to be to teach kids to engage democratically, and part of that is to engage around the question of thinking and dealing with multiple perspectives. A great educator and a friend of mine, mentor, Maxine Green, who was a philosopher of education at Teachers College, Columbia, died last year. We had a wonderful memorial service there, which I spoke at. She's a wonderful person. I'm sure many of you have met her or heard her speak. She used to say this. She said, the purpose of education is to comfort the troubled and trouble the comfortable. And I keep that in the back of my mind, right? Because of course education is to do that thing that we can all agree on so easily, to comfort the troubled, to create a safe space in schools where people can learn and people can advance and develop themselves. Absolutely, that's a goal that's not controversial. But we often forget about that second part of the equation, the one that's essential for democratic societies, and that is troubling the comfortable, making the familiar strange. Right? Asking, is this the best way to organize? Is it the most fair, the most just? Are there any improvements? How do we deal with the fact that well-intentioned, smart people disagree on important matters of social concern? How do we give the kids the tools to deal with that fact? And that's, I think, something that I think is an essential part of a democratic education. Thank you.
I want to talk about the relationship between education and democracy in a different way. And I want to address in particular what political scientists in recent years have called the democratic deficit. And in doing this, I want to draw on, very broadly, a set of researches that I've been involved in the last 10 or 12 years that have been looking at the governance of education. That is to say, the way in which government runs its schools, how schools are governed, who governs the schools, where they are governed from, and the changes that are taking place in relation to those processes. And I also want to set this in a global context. I'm going to give some specific examples as I go along in passing, but I want to emphasise that almost everything I say has a global relevance. And that's because the international landscape of educational governance is changing. And it's changing very quickly at local levels, at national levels, and at global levels. And basic to those changes is that established actors in the processes of governance, particularly democratic and bureaucratic actors, are now being replaced by new organisations and new kinds of actors. And in relation to that, new spaces of policy and governance, and new methods of policy are being introduced. And in relation to that, the form and modalities of government itself are changing. The nature of government is changing. And this doesn't mean there's less governing, rather different forms of governing. And for the most part, these are less democratic forms and less visible forms of governing. It's increasingly difficult to know where decisions are made, who is making them, and how are they being made accountable. And there's a fast expanding global convergence around these issues and changes. And they're part of and related to an ensemble of educational reforms. And these bring changes to all levels of education, from the classroom to the institution, to the national level. And they introduce things like new forms of leadership, new forms of assessment, the move towards an output-driven model for policy. And also they involve the engagement and participation of philanthropic, social enterprise and business organisations in the delivery and design of public sector education. And indeed, they operate in other areas of the public sector, in health and social welfare, prison services. And the important thing is that we understand and we focus upon the individual aspects of these changes. We think about changes in leadership, we think about changes in assessment, we think about changes in pedagogy. But it's also important to see these things together. And this afternoon, Pasi Sabarek, in another laureate session, will talk about some of these things. And he describes this as GERM, the Global Education Reform Movement. But the point I want to add, and the point I want to emphasise, is that we need to understand how these things relate together and the effects of their composite relationship. And those effects are not simply on pedagogy, on organisational structure, on assessment, on leadership. They are effects in terms of governance. They are effects in terms of how systems are organised and run, and as I said, who runs them and from where they are run. And in addition to all of those changes, the other change which is important to recognise is that more and more of the work of policy itself, of policy work, is actually being contracted out to and involves businesses in the processes of policy writing, policy setting, policy framing. The way in which it is possible to think about policy is being framed by management consultants, business consultants of various kinds, who are doing the work that we normally associate with government organisations and agencies. Some of you probably know that in 2013 there was a survey of 300 US educators, and they were asked, among other questions, to identify the person that they thought was most influential at this present time in US education policy. And the overwhelming majority of those 300 named the same person, and that was Bill Gates. Bill Gates is a man who's never run for office, he has no position in government, and he has no mandate for education policy, apart from his money and his political ideas, and the ability to use the former to achieve the latter. And in an era of hyper-accountability, many of the new sites of policy and many of the new policy actors are people like Bill Gates. They are philanthropists, people who run third sector organisations, they are business, education, management organisation companies. And the sites from which they operate are opaque. They're not open to public scrutiny. And very often we must rely entirely on the way in which they account for themselves as the only method of public scrutiny for their activities. In England, although all individual schools are inspected, the third sector organisations that now run chains of what we call academy schools, which are our equivalent of your charter schools, are not themselves subject to public inspection. Despite that, despite the absence of an inspection regime, at the present time, 19 of these chains are what is euphemistically called paused from taking on or opening new schools. And they are paused because of their inadequacies. Several of these chains are running underperforming schools, and many of them have been found to have engaged in financial irregularities in relation to their spending of the government money that they use to organise and run these schools. And more of these revelations appear each week. And studies here in the United States by the National Education Policy Centre, by University of Stanford, raise very similar concerns. Management capabilities, performance outcomes, and financial responsibility is very diverse in the charter school section. There are many good schools, many good charter schools, but there are also many poor charter schools. The diversity of quality is almost exactly the same as the diversity of quality in the public sector. Good schools are good, but there are plenty of bad schools. Over and against this, and in relation to this in England, our local authorities, which are the democratically elected form of local government, are now increasingly excluded from opening new schools and from oversight of the schools in their locality. They do not have oversight of schools that are run by chains, by these third sector providers. And this is residualising the already very weak form of democratic accountability that was available through the operation of these locally elected authorities. And at the same time, the planning of local educational services by local authorities is made virtually impossible by these developments, leading to unnecessary duplication, increasing geographical inequalities, and in effect, the return of a patchwork of provision that looks more and more like the unplanned, uneven, messy, unequal, diverse education system, if it was the system, that existed in England prior to the passing of the 1870 Education Act, which brought a state system into play. Just one point of aside at this moment. I'm saying England because it's important. to separate out what's happening in England from what's happening in Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland. Some of the things I describe are not happening in those constituencies, or they're happening differently. So it's very important always to think about England in relation to these things, not the United Kingdom. And in most of the research, in the most recent research I've been involved in, 2 studies which finished a couple of months ago, I've been exploring similar and related education policy developments in 4 African countries and in India. And in India, the topographical changes, the changes in the landscape of educational governance that I sketched, are also well developed and are developing further very quickly. The participation of non-government providers to run schools based upon the charter school model very directly is being established in several Indian states and several major cities, including Delhi, Mumbai and Pune. And these changes in the running of schools and in educational governance involve the activity and the mobilisation around policy change of a combination of local actors, very powerful local actors, mainly philanthropic, but also global actors working together. And amongst the very recurrent non-Indian actors that appeared in my research are KIP, Knowledge is Power Programme, through their One World network of schools, McKinsey, the Boston Consulting Group, and the Michael and Susan Dell Foundation. And each of these, in their different ways, are involved in exporting US reforms and exporting new modes of governance to India and increasingly to parts of Africa. And finally, and very briefly, at the global level, we're finding the emergence also of entirely new spaces of policy that have developed beyond and between the level of the nation state. And in these arenas, again, we find very often the same actors, but new actors increasingly influential in defining thinking around what counts as good policy. And what I mean by these are spaces like the Clinton Global Initiative, which meets annually in New York, and the WISE Summit, the World Education Innovation Summit, which happens every year in Doha. And many of the organisations I've mentioned and many others who have an interest in education, either a philanthropic interest or a business interest, are coming together in these settings and defining what counts as good practice in education, what counts as innovative education, and are engaged in the dissemination of these ideas to more and more countries around the world. And international education businesses are also increasingly keen to play a part in these new policy arenas, these new sites of policy. And I was saying over breakfast this morning, as part of these research projects with my colleagues, we've been looking in particular at the operation of Pearson, which is well known to you here. Pearson is the world's largest education company. They have an annual turnover of over £5 billion, so $7 billion. And as Diane Ravitch has called it, we can see in many places the process of Pearsonisation of education. But Pearson also operates at a global level, and it's increasingly active in positioning itself as a global policy actor in education. In its 2012 annual report, it indicated a commitment to, and I quote, to playing an active role in helping shape and inform the global debate around education and learning policy. And as part of this, in 2014, the company released a publication called the Learning Curve Report, an associated website and data bank to help governments, teachers and learners identify the common elements of effective education. And if you're interested in looking at that piece of research, it was done for Education International, which is the international organisation of teacher unions. And if you go to Education International website, you can search for Pearson, you will find it. The point is, in all of this, that what counts as what Pearson calls effective education is now being debated in arenas that are not open to democratic participation and democratic education. These arenas are now dominated by unrepresentative, non-democratic, non-elected organisations and actors. The KIPS, the Michael and Susan Dow Foundation, the Pearsons, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and other similar organisations. And perhaps the time has come to think about this as a democratic deficit. And perhaps the time has come for us to get back to basics. And what I mean by that is to engage and invite parents and students and teachers and employers to discuss what effective education is. Not to think about measuring it, but what it's for. What its social purpose is. What does education contribute to society? And it seems to me, at this point in time, we're simply not able to have that discussion. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you.
So I'm Dave Gillborn. I'm at the University of Birmingham in the UK, and my research focuses on racism and race inequality, and in particular I look at the impacts of education policies, mainly in the UK, but also I work quite extensively with colleagues in the critical race theory movement in the US, because there are often very strong parallels between how racism works on either side of the Atlantic. And I think from that perspective, we're at a point in history that's both very interesting but also extraordinarily dangerous. And it's important to remember that in all of the conversations that we're having here about accountability, about teacher recruitment and retention, every single policy is racialized. Its impacts are racialized and very often racist, in as much as the more negative aspects of policy reform tend to impact on racially minoritized groups. And that's regardless of whether race is ever mentioned. Racism often works through apparently colourblind policies, through a whole series of different code words. Now, as you know and has already been discussed, democracy can be one of those codes. It's a very slippery term. In the UK, the government has recently passed a law requiring all schools to teach what they call fundamental British values. And they list various British values, and the very first one is democracy, followed by the rule of law, individual liberty, mutual respect and tolerance of those with different faiths and beliefs. And we don't have a constitution in the UK, so it's very interesting and I think revealing to know that the first iteration of these fundamental British values was in an anti-terrorist piece of legislation. So these values are presented as coming out of a shared kind of progressive history, but they've actually been documented specifically as a part of anti-terrorist legislation to police and to control particular parts of the population. So I think this points to the fact that benign sounding terms like democracy are often used in less than benign ways. And education can be a force for democracy, but too often provides a legitimation for inequality and anti-democratic moves. So education provides a very powerful means by which dominant groups legitimate their dominance. They demonstrate that they deserve to be better off. They deserve to attend the best universities and to earn so much. And they also make the argument that everyone benefits from their privilege, because the myth of a colourblind meritocracy means that even those with the least in society are sold the lie that they would be worse off if we didn't allow the market to ensure that the best rise to the top. And it just so happens that the best tend to be the offspring of the people currently in those positions of dominance. And education provides a perfect mechanism for the system to repeat itself under the veneer of meritocracy. Meanwhile, past victories for social justice are being wiped away. So battles that we thought we'd fought and won decades ago have not just been forgotten, the result has been reversed and the battle has been erased from public memory. So for example, in the UK, including different parts of the constituent parts of the UK, we used to have a whole series of programs to encourage the recruitment and the retention of minority ethnic teachers. Every one of those programs in England has been wiped out. There are no state-funded programs to encourage the recruitment and retention of minority ethnic teachers. And as a result, the workforce is getting whiter. At the same time that this has been happening, the government has been holding private seminars on what they call the genetics of education. And the genetics of education is another one of these code terms. They don't talk about racism anymore, but they talk about genetics, they talk about intelligence. And this is the same government that has recently scrapped something called equality impact assessments. Now, impact assessments were things that had come out of one of the key moments where the extensive and taken for granted nature of racism across public policy, across the police, education, health, had really been exposed. Laws were changed and policymakers were required to do impact assessments. The argument being, before you enact a policy, you have to demonstrate that you've looked at the evidence to see that you won't make things worse, that your new policy won't make things worse for disadvantaged groups. But the government has now removed the requirement to hold those impact assessments, saying that they were burdensome and unnecessary. And at the same time that they've done away with those protections, they've been holding a series of seminars on the genetics of education given by a very eminent scholar at the University of London, Professor Robert Plomin, who publicly supported the bell curve and who described its claims about race and intelligence, claims, you'll remember, that African Americans are genetically predisposed to be less intelligent. He described them, and I quote, as mainstream science. So that's the kind of education science being spoken about in private seminars within the Department for Education at the moment. And in the latest twist, schools and universities are now mandated to be the eyes and ears of the security services. So all schools and universities in England are now legally bound to report any student who they feel may be at risk of radicalisation, particularly by Islamist extremist groups. And on both sides of the Atlantic, walls are being built, physically and metaphorically. And a lot of politicians see votes, they see their own interests in attacking migrants. And every attack on new migrants casts doubt on the true status and the worth of all racially minoritized groups, regardless of what their passports say. So all the public attacks on migrants across Europe are also embodied and reflected in a massive increase in racist harassment on the streets. Now, in the midst of all of this, there are some signs of progress, but as is so often the case throughout history, those moments of progress often come about through human misery, through conflict. The Black Lives Matter campaign, although it started from numerous tragedies, has really, I think, harnessed social media in some important ways that actually show globalization in some positive ways. Actually uniting anti-racists in different parts of the globe to talk about how they can take forward race equality messages. In Europe, you will have seen there's currently a crisis around the movement of hundreds of thousands of refugees and migrants from war-torn and poverty-stricken territories. And again, the human cost is huge, but the crisis has shattered the illusion that globalization can be a one-way process, where the global north can draw riches from the rest of the world, but stay safely untouched behind its borders and its walls. And the outpourings of genuine concern and generosity from the European public have been astonishing, particularly following the publication of a picture that showed the body of Aylan Kurdi, a 3-year-old child who with his family was seeking refuge and was found drowned face down on a Turkish tourist beach. However, even the small gains, the moments of humanitarian warmth that have emerged following these disasters, they remain fragile. The status quo is always fighting back, and there are reactionary dangers in all of this. So in the US, we've seen a backlash against the Black Lives Matter campaign. The right-wing media and commentators link gun crime not to the free availability of guns, but to an image of mentally unstable, angry black men. A stereotype, of course, that's hundreds of years old, but has lost nothing of its power over the years. And mental health is now becoming another one of those code words. Mental health, intelligence, these are codes that are deeply racialized from their very inception and operate in that way on a day-to-day basis. Which kids get sent into the special needs groups where they're basically warehoused, where they're removed from the mainstream. Research on both sides of the Atlantic tells a supremely depressing picture about how these supposedly medicalized processes operate in deeply racialized and racist ways. So the US already has a racist prison industrial complex, and I think we could see that move into overdrive with a whole new complex around mental health and the need to protect certain populations from themselves. In the UK, the fine words of humanity from some have been met with callous, barely concealed hatred from others. If the children drown, well, what were their parents thinking? If thousands of people want refuge, why don't they stay and fight instead of running away? So to link back to Joel's parable from the beginning, if all these kids are floating down the river, well, what about our kids? We have to protect our kids. Maybe we should dam the river, because these kids that are floating down are nothing to do with us. This is the way in which the conversation goes on a day-to-day basis, across TV, across radio chat shows, and also in the Houses of Parliament. So meanwhile, the UK government has done the very barest minimum that it needs to do in order to keep up an appearance of humanity. So in the next 5 years, the UK government has said that it will take 20,000 Syrian refugees. 20,000 refugees over the next 5 years. 20,000 refugees is the same number that arrived in Austria in one weekend last month. And underlying all of this is a process that, borrowing a phrase from Patricia Williams, I've called the monsterization of race equality. Because colour blindness is now aggressively promoted by government, media, and right-wing, very well-funded think tanks, colour blindness is the only way, we're told, of dealing with race and ethnic diversity. We're told that those of us that have worked in anti-racism, we're the cause of unrest and race inequality. So to acknowledge and work against racism in the UK is now to be condemned as a racist, someone who works against white people, in exactly the same way that the Raza studies reforms in Arizona were presented as against white people and outlawed as a kind of racist act against this creation, white people. So in the UK at the moment, democracy and free speech are mobilized as weapons. Democracy has been weaponized. It's now used to empower the state and to alienate progressive movements. Education can be a liberating force, but at the moment, schooling is being colonized as an extra dimension of state surveillance and control. For those of us who care about education as a progressive and a democratic force, the stakes are higher than they've been in living memory, and I think there's a lot that all of us, wherever we're positioned in the system, can and must do to try and take forward a progressive and an egalitarian notion of democracy, not one that turns it into a soundbite and a means of further control. Thank you.
So very happy to be here. Still morning this morning, and to have been accepted into this very distinguished group of educators. Hopefully you can hear me. I'm having a little trouble with some kind of something coming that I'm struggling with. But as America and other nations are becoming increasingly diverse, I think we are challenged to welcome, as David has talked about, the issue of both how to incorporate these diverse ethnic groups, religions, languages, and cultures, but at the same time hold firm to the beliefs and values of our democracy. There are always these inherent tensions that we have between the two notable goals of diversity and unity. I want to emphasize, however, that these principles are not antithetical to each other or potentially conflicting objectives. In our democracy, a person can embrace their cultural and ethnic, individual, and group identities, and they can also, at the same time, share a common national identity as citizens of the United States. As Geneva Gay has stated, conjoining the principles of democracy and diversity ensure that the rights of marginalized and oppressed groups improve the academic performance of all students in all subjects. But nowhere are the tensions between these goals of unity and diversity more obvious and complicated than in our nation's schools. So for the first time in the fall of 2014, the overall number of Latino, African American, and Asian students in U.S. public schools, K through 12, surpassed the number of non-Hispanic whites. This dramatic change has happened primarily because of the dramatic growth of the Latino population and, of course, the decline of the white population. We can expect in 2050 that 34% of U.S. children younger than 17 will either be immigrants themselves or the children of at least one parent who is an immigrant. But let me emphasize here that the mere fact that these numbers are growing in our schools, that's not the problem related to education and democracy. The problem is that these issues threaten the very nature of our democracies because they are connected strongly and directly to the issue of inequality in this country. In 2013, the black poverty rate in every state in this country was higher than the white poverty rate. Upward mobility and intergenerational improvement continue to be the major obstacle. In 1946, the year I was born, a child who was born in poverty had a 50% chance of moving up and becoming part of the middle class. Today, a child has 33% chance of doing this. So the whole notion of this Horatio Alger myth that, working hard and pulling yourself up by your bootstrap is just that, a myth in this democracy. Schools, then, are the institutions that most people turn to address these mammoth problems. Schools should be, like Horace Mann said, the great equalizer of the conditions of life, quote. But in too many instances, schools, particularly schools in low income, high poverty, majority ethnic communities have been places that have institutionalized equality and endangered our democracy. The annual turnover in urban high-poverty schools that serve students of color are nearly 70% higher than the turnover in low-poverty schools. These are teachers who come in and they go out, and then they get the experience and they're gone someplace else. These students are also likely to be in schools that are taught by the most inexperienced teachers. The teachers are likely to be uncertified, and they are likely to teach in subjects that they did not even have a minor in college. These teachers perform less well than other teachers on college admissions and teacher licensure exams. We have a big problem in this country. It is called hyper-segregation. Students in this country are more likely to attend a segregated school than they did in 1968. That's really a sobering statistic. So when people talk about democracy and equality and diversity, really the diversity is a goal and a principle we adhere to, but where is diversity when we have hyper-segregation in housing, hyper-segregation in schools, and students aren't learning the principles of cooperation and working with each other in terms of people who are different? That's a national policy that has to be addressed. And these kids are not doing well in the schools I just described. 47% of white students scored proficient or above in reading, compared to just 16% of African American children. You really don't want to know about how they do in math. That is even more dismal and disappointing. But what kind of schools are these students going to? These students in these high poverty, low income schools are exposed to a test driven, low standards, low expectations curriculum that failed to teach these kids the very nature of what democracy is. That is, those questioning skills that Joel was talking about, those skills that are necessary to be efficacious citizens and politically engaged in their own community. They are not encouraged to voice and defend their position. They are not encouraged to advocate for justice and fairness for others. So in other words, Joel, we don't have to go to no career to find these totalitarian places. I could take you to some places, probably without even working really hard, we can find them around here in this city. So I believe then that without attention to these data about achievement, the poverty gap, the income gap, the wealth gap, and the opportunity gaps, the principles of democracy are clearly jeopardized. My research has focused on the theme of education democracy through the lens of the social and the cultural context of teaching and learning, particularly what is called culturally responsive pedagogy. Culturally responsive pedagogy builds on the principle that learning may differ across cultures and that teachers can enhance student success by acquiring knowledge of students and their communities and translating this knowledge into effective instruction. This area of research has its theoretical roots in research about learning as a socially mediated process related to students' cultural experiences. Culturally responsive pedagogy addresses culture, pedagogy, content knowledge. And content knowledge, of course, is knowledge of the discipline. Pedagogy concerns classroom lesson planning and delivery of instruction. And I believe that a thorough and deep understanding of all three of these competencies, that is culture, pedagogy, and content knowledge, helps teachers to effectively instruct their students. Competent, culturally responsive teachers know how to employ multiple representations of knowledge that use students, and here's the key, everyday lived experiences to motivate and assist them by doing what? By connecting new knowledge to students' current knowledge and using their home and community experiences. These multiple representations involve finding pertinent examples, comparing and contrasting, bridging the gap between the known, that is the students' everyday lived experiences and their personal and cultural knowledge, and the unknown, and that is the materials and concepts that we as educators want to teach. One example that I saw and was inspired by was this teacher who worked in a very poverty-stricken community, of boarded-up houses, abandoned in both psychological and other kinds of ways, in physical sense. And her job was to teach, she was teaching writing to 6th graders. And she had a template that was mandated by someone in some central office in instruction about how to teach these African-American children, these hyper-segregated communities, about writing. And the goal was to write a persuasive essay. And so what she did was she took that plan and she set it aside and she said, I'm going to teach you how to write a persuasive essay. And the first thing I want you to do is I want you to work individually. And I want you to go into your home and your communities, because we're going to write an essay, first individually and then cooperatively, and we're going to write a persuasive essay, and we're going to email that mayor and tell him what he needs to do to come in our community and make it better. This is the best of good teaching. So she said, first let's survey and divide the community up. We're going to ask people, what's wrong with our community and what can the mayor do? And she taught them how to write the questions. They collected the data. She showed them how to make a graph, how to do, use your data, and how to collect the data, accumulate the data, interpret the data. They wrote the individual essays. She followed the standards in terms of editing, verb-subject agreement, conjunctions and prepositions. She said, one voice, that's just one person, but let's write a collective persuasive essay to the mayor and tell him what he needs to do to make our community better. And they wrote it and they emailed it, and she later told me, guess who showed up next week at the school? Bam. She taught them a lot about writing that day, didn't she? So culture is something that people just assume, I'm running out of time, it's something that only people of color have. And you don't have a culture unless you're African American, Latino, or Asian, but every student has a culture. And these cultural issues, I think, are, of course, we know, passed down from one generation to the other. But this area of research in which I work is very, can be both promising and it also can be very scary. Because it's very clear that culture, particularly ethnicity, influences student-teacher relationships and student learning. It must be emphasized. And here's the point, that cultural behaviors are learned behaviors, and hence they can be unlearned and modified. Culture is not static, it's not deterministic, it's not predictive. Students, you don't have one list of things about what African American students do, and here what Asian students do, and what Latino students do. Students are not mere products of their culture. Consequently, culture affects students in very different ways. It's constantly evolving, and although some students may share the same cultural background and predispositions, not all members of the same group behave identically, or they identify with their culture in some degree. So consequently, teachers who are trained in this area must learn that students are first individuals. They're not representatives of any cultural group. Well, I'm gonna, just a couple of other points. And I think what I will do is, in the few minutes I have, is just bullet some other myths associated with this. It's not, as James Banks, who is also a laureate of this group, it's not Black History Month, Hispanic Heritage Month, Foods Festival posters, which I had to help my grandson the other day who wanted to do a poster about Hispanics, and guess who he said he knew something about? George Lopez. I said, George Lopez, do you know anybody else? Did they teach you about anybody else except an Hispanic comedian? Che Guevara, you know who that is? Well, because grandma does a lot of teaching. It's not a magic bullet that's used to solve the achievement gap problem. Also, the myth that only as teachers of color can be culturally relevant. It's not a feel-good part of the curriculum. We want children to feel good, but the purpose of it is for students to achieve. It's compatible with standards in both the disciplines and national and content standards. And when taught this way, I believe that this kind of pedagogy, which has to do cultural responses, not just pedagogy, but content knowledge, issues of social mediated experiences, can make a difference. Because I believe that democracy cannot succeed unless all students, regardless of their race, class, ethnicity, religion, gender, and sexual orientation, are educated to reach their highest potential. Thank you very much.